Women's Network Philippines, Indigenous Women's, International Indigenous Women's Forum FIMI, MADRE, National Indigenous Women's Federation NIF Nepal, United Nations Human Rights Office of the High Commissioner OSCHR, Regional Office for Southeast Asia, Perempuan Aman Indonesia, and Voice. So you can already see this is a very collective effort and collective participation of Indigenous women and other organizations across the globe. So you can join us through this Zoom webinar platform with us for an hour. This event will be conducted in English language, and it will be live streamed on FIMI's YouTube channel. And the issues, we will also issue a statement from Indigenous Women's Group. It's a collective statement from Indigenous Women's Group as an outcome of this event. So we also have this hashtag we are using. You can also use for sharing your information. Voices of Indigenous Women, High Level Political Forum 2020, Indigenous Women, We Are Indigenous. So these are the hashtags we are using. I think we all are aware that we have completed 5 years of the implementation of SDGs, but we are still far behind in achieving those goals. So the SDGs global and regional reviews have already disclosed that there is like big gap and then ongoing like grave inequality across the world. So as Indigenous peoples, Indigenous women, persons with disability are the most affected groups facing this inequality and injustice across the world, and particularly in Asia, because of the majority of the Indigenous people living in this region. So there is still, we are like demanding for the disaggregated data to be, like included based on ethnicity in the SDGs goals and indicators. So we can see that how the situation is. In addition to that, the COVID-19 global pandemic has severely impacted the world's population. The Indigenous peoples, Indigenous women, elders, persons with disability are disproportionately impacted. That has been already showing with different reports at the regional and global level. The impact of this crisis is not only limited on health, but on socio-economic condition, including mobility, livelihoods, income generation, and access to food in the Indigenous communities. And we can already see the impact in the Indigenous communities, as in many of the rural areas, Indigenous peoples living in the rural areas are still deprived from culturally appropriate and timely information on COVID related, and then how they can combat against it in their mother language. Indigenous peoples are also facing intensified racial discrimination, criminalization, and human rights violation against Indigenous peoples in various manners, and that is across Asia. Many Asian governments are also introducing these regressive policies and laws that are violating the rights of Indigenous peoples at the time of COVID. And Indigenous peoples' human rights defenders are highly at risk and threat for the protection and promotion of their rights to land, territories, and resources. But despite these challenges, it has been proved that Indigenous peoples have the most sustainable good practices and traditional customary system that they have been practicing centuries. Even that has been proved that it is one of the most sustainable way to combat this kind of pandemic and then a crisis from the Indigenous people's perspective. So today's session, we will be also looking into these perspectives, how COVID and SDGs at the time of implementation of SDGs and during this COVID crisis time, what are the different kind of impacts that Indigenous peoples are facing? And then at the same time, we also will see and hear from our speakers how and where we are in terms of achieving sustainable development goals. At the same time, now everybody knows this is a new normal. I think this is not a new word anymore now. So how like Indigenous peoples are taking up, or like how they are coping with this new normal situation and how they are defining this new normal situation will be another points of discussion that we want to hear from the speakers. And also, as I already mentioned, there is immense level of collective actions and self-initiatives from the community level, particularly Indigenous communities. Indigenous women are coming forward to combat against the crisis. So how our actions are also helping to deal with this new normal situation, accelerating and achieving these SDG goals, and what are the gaps and challenges that we are facing. And then, I mean, not only thinking of the problems and challenges, but what are the way forward, how we can do things like in a collective way and in a positive way to tackle those situations. So we have very powerful two Indigenous women leaders as speakers today. And we also have a special remarks from OHCHR Bangkok team. Both speakers will get 10 minutes each for the presentation, and we'll also take some questions from the audience, from the participants. So yes, let's start with Kakai Tolentino. Kakai represents Indigenous women of the Dumagat group in Sierra Madre Mountain in the Philippines. Currently, she is serving as a national coordinator of BAI Indigenous Women's Network in the Philippines. BAI is a network of Indigenous women's organization in the Philippines, working to strengthen the capacity and solidarity of Indigenous women towards the full recognition and respect of women for their collective rights to ancestral land and self-determination. So Kaka is also representing as a focal person of the Philippines, and she's also one of the steering committee member of from Southeast Asia sub-region, representing in the network of Indigenous women in Asia, that's NIWA. So she will be sharing some of the like the struggle of Indigenous women in the Philippines while claiming for the rights to land, life and self-determination in the Philippines in the context of SDG and current pandemic situation and how they are responding this current situation. Kakai, the floor is yours. Please. Yes, Kakai?
Yes. I'm ready.
Yeah.
So I will go. Good morning, good evening. Salamat pangi. Masampat tabe, abe kita mapesan honorable guests, delegates. The Bay Indigenous Women's Network, a member of the Regional Network of Indigenous Women, is honored to share with you the Philippines Indigenous Women's collective action and contributing to the achievement of the SDGs towards the 2030 agenda of eradicating poverty and hunger and for achieving ecologically sustainable and socially just economy. We will share our learnings and way forward reflecting COVID-19 pandemic for accelerated actions from Indigenous people's perspective. BAI welcomes the 17th Sustainable Development Goals and commit to contribute our collective actions to achieving the 2030 agenda. But in order to achieve the SDGs, a people-centered rights-based development framework should be adopted, adhering to SDGs key principles. However, in contrast, the Philippine Development Plan 2017 to 2022, wherein the Philippines roadmap of the SDGs is anchored on is overly market-oriented and profit-based development framework in favor of big local, national, and multi-corporations at the expense of indigenous peoples in the country. This is due to the long-standing discrimination and disregards of indigenous people's rights by the government and its institutions. Amid the COVID-19 backdrop, plunder and state-sponsored land grabbing continued, and the indigenous peoples, including indigenous women, were among the hardest hit as new repressive laws and economic policies were devised while existing laws and programs continue to be implemented forcefully. Under the neoliberal development path, ancestral lands were open to continuing plunder, especially with the complete liberalization of mining under the Mining Act of 1995. Various laws and programs of reforestation, such as the National Integrated Protected Areas System law and the National Greening Program. To address the economic impact of the COVID crisis, the government proposed to continue and prioritize its projects under the Build program as the key to recover economic losses by the crisis. Among the priority projects and ancestral territories are the Kaliwakanan Laiban Dam inside Dumagat territories in the Sierra Madre Mountain and the new Clark City and Aita ancestral lands in Tarlac and Pampanga provinces. Pursuing these projects will not only trample on the Dumagat and Aita's rights to ancestral lands and self-determination, but will also have a great impact on their economic life and livelihood. The joint proposal of the Department of Agriculture and the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, or NCIP, to convert portion of ancestral territories in lumad areas in Mindanao for commercial agriculture under the Plant program will not solve the economic problem but will lead to further land grabbing of ancestral lands. All these so-called development projects hinder our collective action and customary practices that promote sustainable use of natural resources in our ancestral lands. Our contribution as frontline stewards of the environment continue to be neglected. We are further pushed to the margins, and many of us are left without access to basic health and social services. Our rights to expression and assembly, asserting a right to the self-determination through genuine democratic participation in policy making and governance were violated severely as we were not able to organize and mobilize ourselves during lockdown situations. We are never really part of the decision-making process, including for projects that encroach on our ancestral lands. The government military's response to the COVID-19 pandemic worsened our plight. Being in remote and isolated areas, IPs largely remain out of the coverage of emergency reliefs, public health services, and infrastructures, including free mass testing, are lacking or far from the communities. In areas where COVID-19 cases were detected, such as in Mindoro Island, Pampanga in Central Luzon, and Benguet in the Cordillera, limited testing and contact tracing were done. This makes the IPs more vulnerable to the spread of COVID-19 disease. Amid the pandemic, we face continued harassment by state forces through military operation, including red tagging and vilifications of our leaders and organizations. However, we continue our struggle to defend what remains of our ancestral lands, while we continue to demand equal access to basic health and social services, livelihoods, education, and humanitarian assistance during this time of pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed the weak Philippine economic fundamentals, and despite establishment of government agencies to oversee IP concerns such as the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, continued to neglect our welfare. Our struggle continues today amid the pandemic. Our history have shown that Indigenous women along the men waged and won these struggles and amid government neglect with multiplier effect of COVID-19, Philippine indigenous peoples, especially the bi-indigenous women, rose above the challenges. Indigenous peoples' collective culture led us pursue alternatives to uplift our communities. This includes establishing our own community-run energy sources through the micropower hydropower systems that continued to support our livelihood, health and sanitation, as well as education of our children. Our sustainable agricultural practices that sustain both our food and health needs even during the time of COVID-19, which was instrumental. Establishment of alternative learning schools, which for decades strengthened and developed IP cultural and political systems and contributed to IP empowerment, including especially among indigenous women. Intergenerational indigenous knowledge exchange remained intact. Youth engaged themselves in COVID-19 daily diaries, organized ourselves for appeals for emergency responses, the reliefs collection and distribution including foods, medicines, and health gears. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed the bankruptcy of neoliberal framework of development and at the same time provides provided us an opportunity to showcase indigenous people's significance to fight against the global crisis and achieving the 2030 agenda. But it needs fixes and we demand new normal that does away with the overrated neoliberal policies of privatization, liberalization, deregulation, and prioritize private profit for private businesses to prosper. We want a new normal that adopts a people-centered human rights-based approach to development where people, including the most marginalized and indigenous people, have genuinely democratic participations in governance and development processes. This includes the recognition of indigenous people's rights to self-determination and over their ancestral lands. We call on government to prioritize health and other vital social services such as education, housing, social protection, measures to promote people's well-being, prepare and capacitate them to survive shocks caused by pandemics and economic crisis. We call on the UN bodies to have stronger mechanism in making development actors, especially governments, accountable for all its action in the implementation of the 17 SDGs and for the violations to people's economic, social, and cultural rights. So this all my presentation, and I welcome all the questions.
Yeah, thank you, Kakai, for your presentation covering, I think, quite a range of information and issues in relation to indigenous peoples in the Philippines. I just wanted to ask you one, because I think one of the hardly hit areas is the education, and then where children are being deprived from going to school, attend education because of this COVID situation. I think you mentioned about these alternative learning schools. in the context of Philippines. So can you share with us like how this kind of, I think, promotion of this kind of schools are helping to fill in the gaps, like where a lot of children, especially indigenous children living in the rural areas, are deprived from attaining education because this so-called this new normal situation is not allowing them because of the requirement of this equipment, and then like online classes, like there is no internet, like services in those areas. So I think this system that you have developed is quite, I think, exemplary. So how you think that this has helped to promote this education system in an alternative ways?
The concept of IP education we established since 1980s is based on our and traditional knowledge and practices, because the long-standing negligence of the government on the services of education, we strive to build and make a simple structure in the community. And that is, we gain, or we have now in the Mindanao Island, the 244 community IP schools. That was on the big issue of this government Duterte, because this school is catering free schooling of the community children and youth, and the modules are based on how to enhance the traditional knowledge and practices in um, in enhancing or developing the agricultural practices of the communities. So more on the modules are based on how to protect, how to develop, and how to manage the community ownership of the land. And besides, there is also the regular academic subjects.
Okay, thank you, Kakai, for your response. Now I'll move to Kamla. Kamla Thapamagar is our another speaker. She's representing, she belongs to Magar Indigenous Community of Nepal, and currently she is working as the executive director of in National Indigenous Women's Federation, NIF. NIF is an umbrella organization of 43 indigenous women's organization, and they're also working for raising awareness and for the rights of indigenous women in Nepal. NIF is also one of the member of our network of indigenous women Asia, NIWA. Kamla has been engaging with indigenous women's movement in Nepal, and her expertise on indigenous women's rights, on climate change have been pertinent in the indigenous people's movement at national, regional, and global level. So right now she's representing, actually presenting the collective voices of indigenous women from India, Bangladesh, and Nepal, because these three countries are being reviewed in 2020. The CSOs, including indigenous peoples and indigenous women with disabilities organization, were quite actively engaged in the development of voluntary national review reports in Nepal, Bangladesh, and in India. So it's more of a collective kind of presentation. She's going to do it from these three countries. So Kamla, yes, the floor is yours.
Good evening and good morning to everyone. Thank you, Chanda. And due to the behalf of collective voices of indigenous women from three countries, India, Bangladesh, and Nepal, we would like to express our gratitude to the organizers to provide us to voice our issues, voice our concerns, voice our recommenders through these events. And I'm presenting behalf of three countries through the VNR countries related on the SDG 2030 as a VNR countries. So um, the collective voices that we have prepared, like indigenous peoples impacted on the SDG goal by the COVID-19 has severely affected where indigenous peoples, especially indigenous women, youth, children, elderly, person with disability, LGBTIQ, migrants, daily earners facing a big challenges of poverty, hunger, starvation during the pandemic and lockdown by the government. So this is how, due to this, indigenous women's are facing lots of challenges like increase of maternal mortality rate, suicidal cases are increasing day to day, health risks are high, gender-based violences, discrimination, loss of job, employment, and criminalization of human rights defenders within our own land is increasing day to day. And COVID-19 disrupted the regular pattern of our daily life. Indigenous women are not in the decision making, and they are ignored, and getting the access, the fundamental right to access the information, that our indigenous women are lagged behind because of not getting the indigenous women are not getting the information on their own languages, because in Nepal and in Bangladesh and India, indigenous peoples are they use the mother tongue in their languages, but the information provided by the government is only in English and Nepali. That was limited to access our information in the government, in the community level. So that's why we're lag behind on that part as well. But for this, moving to our another slide, like further, but for indigenous women, we indigenous women are the knowledge holder. We have a hope. We have a hope that we are a knowledge holder and game changer. We have a power to transform a pandemic into opportunity, to derive new normal by the applying our knowledges, our skills. Giving an example of Odisha, Jharkhand, and Chhattisgarh from India, they have the indigenous women have prepared herbal sanitizer from the mawa flowers. And also there is a Santhal community from India and in Nepal as well. There are lots of communities, indigenous peoples communities has already initiating letting outside not to letting outsider not to enter their community, to prevent their communities from the pandemic, from the COVID-19. So this is the initiation that indigenous peoples and indigenous women are strongly following. That another giving example of Northeast India from Nagaland, indigenous women have a good knowledge collecting wild vegetables like mushrooms and other wild vegetables, and they have collected that wild vegetables and provided in the quarantine center to prevent, to make sure that the indigenous peoples are with them in the quarantine center, to make more psychological defense. No, so indigenous women also set up the vegetables hubs during the pandemic in Nagaland to provide their services in their community, to not to provide their services to have a economic to prevent from the economic crisis as well. So this is the process that indigenous women are giving the best practices in their communities to face the COVID-19. Also, there is a psychological counseling through sharing the experience by the elders in the community, that already initiated by the elders to make more mental free from this economic crisis from the COVID-19. So youth are also in the psychological problem. So this will definitely help. Sharing the experience by the elders will definitely help the younger to prevent from the COVID-19, to make free mental services. No, so this is the things that the indigenous peoples, indigenous women are practicing. And also in midland India and in Nepal also, they are using the agriculture production, for forcing agriculture production in the qualitative basis, like village people treating own home with their herbal medicines to protect COVID-19 as well. So this is how indigenous peoples, indigenous women are using their traditional knowledges to fight against with COVID-19, and they know how to mobilize the resources with the sustainable manner. Also, they have a collective customary practices, and they have a knowledge of food security system also. So the customary self-governance systems has provided the resource mobilizations with a sustainable way. So this is because indigenous women have a collectivism, because we feeling, due to the we feeling, we always care for others, we always care for our community. This is our main theme, to protect our community by our own resource, by our knowledge, and by our skill. Next slide. So in the meantime, for the new normal, indigenous women have a different view with the new normal in the after the pandemic, because we indigenous women are strongly practicing our customary practices that easy to adapt in a new normal way, because of having our traditional customary practices in the regular basis. And we are continuing our knowledge and skills in the community to fighting against crisis of economy, that I already shared the examples that that in the community that we are doing, like setting a vegetable hub in the community like this, no? So and also the sanitizer that making from the herbal mawa flowers, that is also the good good way of economic empowerment in the future, if the government will recognize our traditional knowledge and skills. So we have a strong belief on customary life also. We always support our community with our strong belief customary practices, and we develop strong common strategies how to make our community stronger. This is the collective action that we always face, and we always continue. And identifying issue, how to and we also identify the issue and collective mobilization, how to mobilize our resources with a sustainable way. And we are also inclusion in decision making in all level is very needed, and for the new normal we are seeking this inclusion in the decision making level as well. Next slide. So land is our means of life, but our lands are transforming in aggressive development without permission and consent. We have criminalizing on our own land. As giving an example of recently we are facing a protest in the Kathmandu Valley in Newa community, Newa Khokana village, that indigenous people protesting from their own lands by cultivating their rights in their collective way. But the police has beaten us without any giving consent, like not consent any information. We like this is the things that criminalizing within our own land is going very rigorously, and we are impacting on that part. For new normal, indigenous women wants human right based approaches to develop. We ask for democratic participation, including indigenous people's right self-determination. But these things are not happening in our community. If you talk about the Chittagong Hill Tract, there is a due to the militarization, indigenous women are more facing challenges of rape cases, killing and kidnapping are increasing day to day, and we are always be in the threatened position in the community. So this is how. And in Nepal also, in the national parks and protected areas, indigenous women has to be threatened while going in the forest to collect the forest products. We are harassing, we are torturing by charges as an illegal hunter, illegal poachers. This is the things that we are facing in our own land. Um, for our giving an way forward to SDG 2030, we call to review the SDG targets, ensuring compatibility with UNDRIP. This UNDRIP is our rights for indigenous peoples, and our state are not using the UNDRIP, not implementing the UNDRIP, that they are ignoring these things. So we all review the SDG target, ensuring compatibility with UN DRIP, recognize customary self-governance system in practices as well, because the right to meaningful participation of indigenous women in all decision-making level is not happening. So we urge our government to have a right to meaningful participation of indigenous women in all level of decision-making. And also the documentation, because of not having disaggregated data related on the documentation process, we are facing a big challenges that how indigenous women are getting deprived from all those challenges due to not having disaggregated data. So we urge our government, our state, to have the documentation with disaggregated data and design cultural sensitive approach to meet our challenges and to minimize our problems. And in the last, we also call UN bodies to have stronger mechanism in many development actors, especially government, accountable to active SDG goal 2030. So and also ensure right to self-determination with full and meaningful participation in every decision making. And next slide. And also another is ensure free, prior and informed consent to protect collective ways of life and collective rights, because this is the identity of indigenous peoples, and recognize, protect, and replicate indigenous knowledge and practices, and in-depth studies, documentation with cultural sensitive, and also strong and earmark resources and support building strong network at all levels. Thank you. Thank you. And this is the behalf of National Indigenous Women's Federation, Interstate Adivasi Women's Network, Midland India, Nagaland Indigenous Women's, Bangladesh Indigenous Women's Network, National Indigenous Women's Forum, National Indigenous Disabled Women Association. Thank you. And I would like to welcome all the questions if you have any queries. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Kamla, for your wonderful presentation. It's quite powerful. The most important thing is the collective effort that you have presented. It's not only at the community level, but you are also trying to build that collective solidarity and support among the indigenous women group in all three countries. I think that's quite impressive to hear how you have made this whole presentation also not only as a part of this event, but also trying to build that solidarity and support. Thank you. Just a quick question, because I think you also mentioned there is quite increased violence against women. There is also increased violence against indigenous women, also different parts, whether that be, I mean, during COVID or even non-COVID situation, also it's happening across these three countries. So at this situation, we can hear more news, because recently also we learned that in Nepal, a woman was raped in the quarantine center. So there is this whole issue of the security of women is where we are, like where is government, how government is responding to protect the rights of women, and it's particularly in this kind of crisis situation, what are the mechanisms that that the government has been implementing, if you have any experience, or we know that government mechanisms are not very like supportive to indigenous communities, but do you have any experience or like how indigenous women are also collectively coming together to particularly address the issue of violence against indigenous women at the time of crisis?
Yes, thank you, Chanda. Yes, we are facing lots of challenges during this pandemic, COVID-19, and also the violence against people's, indigenous women's and women's are increasing day to day. As you mentioned that rape cases are increasing day to day, and in Nepal, basically, I एकदम disturb. Basically, like rape cases that increasing day to day in Nepal as well and India as well. So, addressing your questions related with the violence against India, violence against women, and also the government mechanism that you also mentioned that our government mechanism to address violence against women is very weak, and still we are very facing challenges, lots of challenges within the quarantine also, and we have initiated being gathering indigenous women's organization in Nepal to have, and also in the parliament, in the parliament also they raise the issues that the quarantine centers should be separated men and women. So this is the initiation that we are, because this pandemic, in future also there may be lots of pandemic coming, so we have to be make sure that women should be secure on this type of violence, no. So also this from the federal level to local level, they already have this kind of messages to have quarantine separately and address the violence against women and violence against indigenous women. But still there is lots of challenges to make this kind of mechanism strongly in the local level, because of not having economic status of government as well. So the strongly we are indigenous women's and women organization are strongly giving them a recommendation or giving them the pressure, and pressure by providing the statement through the ministries. But still there is a big challenge to overcome with this violence against women. But we are doing from our effort to make overcome these challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Kamla, for your response. We are also receiving questions in the chat box. So we request all the participants, if you have any burning questions, then you please drop your questions in the chat box. We will try to address through our speakers as much as possible, because only we have 1 hour time. There is a question from our friend Lok Yimpeng. The question is, this is for both the speakers. I think I would also request you to respond in a very precise manner, in a short, like maybe in 1 minute, because we still have some more, we still have speaker from OHCHR and some questions we want to have from the participants. This question is, how do you deal with language barrier to enable your community to understand information dissemination? So I think this is an underlying challenge, that information right on timely manner in your own mother language, that we have been demanding. So what is the situation in the context of Nepal and Philippines? It's also related to this. We have Yasho Kanti from Nepal. What she has shared is, in Nepal, almost all the schools have started these online classes. So, and those students who study in private schools, they have access to this, this kind of provision. But students studying in the public schools are deprived from this, like attaining education. So what is the situation in Philippines? It's also related to that. So I pose this question to Kakai, and then the first question about information dissemination, like you can respond, both of you can respond. Yeah.
Okay. Uy, Kamla? Are you the one or me?
Okay, I think Kaka, you can start.
Okay. On the first question about the language barrier, um, the actual experience in the community is we translated in the actual. For example, we received the flyers or journals from our other organizations or stakeholders. We read first and we will translate into local language. And others mechanism is to, for example, in line with old people, we also translate the whatever information in making a drawing to make them understand what you are saying or what is on the magazine, like that.
Okay. Yes, Kamla?
Yes, like that you mentioned that information dissemination status of Nepal. Like we are always ask our government to provide our information with our own languages, because in Nepal, like there are like 60 indigenous peoples are already recognized by the government. Indigenous peoples are recognized by the government, where almost more than 55 indigenous people speak their own languages. So having if you getting right to information on this kind of pandemic is very basic and it's fundamental as well. But our indigenous people who don't understand the Nepali language and English language is lag behind to understand, to make prepare themselves to fight against COVID-19. So um, uh, initiation from the government to disseminate the information through our language, through our own language like mother language, is very lag behind. But some indigenous peoples, indigenous organizations are already initiated providing information in the more dominant areas to on the COVID-19, like Tamang, Magar, Gurung has Newar has already started in their communities. But other highly marginalized indigenous peoples who don't have economically, who are not viable, are not getting such information access in their communities. So they are and they have to be prepared because they are in the vulnerable conditions. The infection rate is very high in those areas, because of not getting because of not having any preparedness. And also Nepal government has also provided lots of relief packages, but we indigenous peoples are not getting that relief packages as well, due to not having access to information. The limit Due to the limited information, we are also lag behind to get relief packages as well in the communities as well. And regarding the addressing of education system in Nepal, that Nepal government has already started a radio, through the radio and through the TV program to intervene the education process. But if you talk about the community of indigenous and highly marginalized indigenous peoples in the community, are they really get this? Are they really benefited from this process? No, never, because our indigenous people are not getting even we don't have no we don't have not access to the light as well. We don't have electricity in the community. And also due to the weather bad conditions, this is the monsoon period, there is the fluctuation of electricity in the community. They don't have access that education system, and that's why our indigenous boys, young girls and children are lacking of this education process provided by the government. So we are also also strongly pressurize our government to have this kind of education system, easy access to education system with our own mother language in the community, but still it is not happening in our community. That's why our children are deprived from this opportunity. And again, this COVID and COVID also additionally making us backward. Thank you.
Thank you, Kamla. Before I go to Katia, there is one question I want to. We got it from the chat box. Our friend Bernie has asked this question. So most of the governments in Asia have actually taken advantage of this contagious like pandemic to tighten their authoritarian grip and intensify their grab for power. So I think you also mentioned, Kamla, earlier this situation, this pandemic situation of pandemic is also like taking as an opportunity. So I think her question is also related to that, like how Indigenous women are taking advantage of this situation, like in terms of this government negligence, like the government is neglecting Indigenous peoples, Indigenous women's situations, how they are strengthening their like agenda, and then how they are like advocating, pursuing their agenda at this time.
Yes. Yes, we always said, and this is the truth, that we are a knowledge holder and we are the custodian of land, natural resources, and water. And we Indigenous women, with a full rich knowledge, we can survive in every kind of pandemic situation if the government will provide us, if provide us the platform, if the government will recognize our knowledge, if the government will strengthen our self determination and self governance system, and if the government will recognize our customary practices. But yes, we are still doing, though government has not recognized us, our practices, our customary practices. We are still continuing our knowledge to survive and to fight against this kind of pandemic and future pandemic also. And we also said that this is we can help. This is an opportunity also to overcome this kind of future pandemic also, because we have knowledge and we are continuing this knowledge. And through this we can from our knowledge, our skills could be is still not transforming into economic empowerment. But we said that if the government will support transforming our knowledge in the economic empowerment, it will be the best practices and best way to cope with cope this kind of pandemic and future pandemic also. And also we can overcome with the economic crisis as well. But government is not recognizing our knowledge, and even we are criminalizing in our own natural resources while collecting, going in the forest as well. That I'm sharing recently happening in Chiton National Park in Nepal, that young indigenous boys are caught while fishing in the pandemic, in the lockdown duration. They were charged 10,000 rupees each after to free, make them free. This is happening. They are they make us criminal within our system, no? So because in this pandemic situation we need food, and we know how to collect sustainable way from the forest. We have a knowledge, but there is the government policies, discriminated policies, has deprived us to access our own resources and to make us to make us to fight against economic crisis. So this is the things that if government will support us, if government will recognize us, then we can sure we can be in the new normal life, fighting against this kind of pandemic with our knowledge, with our system, with our process, with our self-governance system. Thank you.
Thank you, Kamla. Kakai, do you want to respond quickly?
Yes, regarding on the online education, ang our part as indigenous peoples, it's very hard to adapt this system of education because most of our communities are in the far-flung places. There's no access of internet, and especially there is no gadgets for the children or the youth. So now the Department of Education is insisting to open the schooling on August 24. But as I received situation from my community in Sierra Madre, the community is provided by friend cell phone for the children, and they video themselves on the and on their Kaingin or Sweden farm just to get the internet access. And they the one unit of cell phone was used by 10 children. They are now practicing how to use the cell phone, but it is very hard for us as indigenous peoples that despite of this pandemic, we are so deprived from these technologies because the distance is very far from the cities. And one thing, the people in the community is not prioritizing in buying these gadgets because the priority of the community is how they sustain their daily existence, not for the gadgets. So this is the situation of our communities, most of our communities in the far-flung places, and also in regarding to the LUMAD students, it is not suitable to follow the digital education because we are strongly holding the indigenous knowledge and practices that was cropped up in a module for the LUMAD school. So this is how we can still coping up how the students or the youngs has access or have the access in education in terms of the online or modular education that was given from the or insisting by the Department of Education.
Thank you, Kakai. Yeah, there are quite a lot of questions and then comments we are receiving, but we have very limited time. Now I'll move to Katia. Sorry. Yeah, so we have Katia Chiriji as a special guest for her special remarks. She's the Deputy Representative OSCHR Southeast Asia Regional Office, which is based in Bangkok, Thailand. She had joined OSCHR in 2015, but prior to that, she has a long experience working with the OHCHR office in several countries in the Asia Pacific region, including Maldives, Sri Lanka, India, Bhutan, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. So she has also worked in Nepal for quite long. So currently she is serving as a deputy representative at the OHCHR office in Bangkok. So Katia, yes, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chanda, and I'm really privileged to come at the end of this very rich presentation and discussion by the panelists and their inspirational work being done by their organization and your organization in the region. So it is me who is privileged. I certainly do not consider myself a special guest. I will keep my thoughts very short, hoping maybe there could be some extra minutes for any final round of questions. But I think what we heard from your initial presentation, Chanda, and also what Kakai and Kamala has guided us through, really points at the key issues linked to the impact of COVID-19 on the rights of indigenous people in the region, the impacts on women and girls, but also how women are drivers of change also in this context, and are part really much in the forefront of finding solutions. And maybe I just would like to highlight, how a number of the issues we heard about bring us to the realization that the full implementation of a number of rights which are affected by the impact of COVID-19 and the pandemic which is the right to health, the right to food, employment, and many others, are linked to another wider host of rights, being it the right to self-determination, development, culture, land, and of course, a healthy environment. And we heard a lot about the importance of having disaggregated data, which is able to show us how different groups are impacted and affected differently by COVID-19, including indigenous women and girls. And we heard a lot about the importance of the availability of whether it's preventive measures or responsive measures in accessible languages. And I think here the issue is broader than languages. It also has to be done in a communication style which meets the needs of the recipients. So there was an example shared about the use of cartoons just being one of the possible ways of being creative. But it's not just about the language we use, but also the communication style which is used. I think I would like to focus also on one specific aspect, which is linked to how taking stock of the traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples and the particular role played by women in here can also turn the pandemic into an opportunity and addressing wider challenges which are linked to the impact of climate change and the ability through that to contribute to the realization of the right to a healthy environment. So it's really about trying to build on the opportunities which the pandemic has brought, in addition to the obvious challenges that everyone is grappling with. And I would really like to end by stressing how, while indigenous women in the region, with no exception to what happens around the world, are indeed facing a host of challenges linked to the pandemic. Their practical participation as agents of change is essential for achieving a meaningful realization of the entire 2030 agenda and accelerating the realization of sustainable development goals. Just on a very final note, I would like to share that, of course, this is a priority issue for our office here in the region and globally. And OHCHR has just launched, just last week, a guidance note on the impact on indigenous people of COVID-19, which we will be sharing the reference of shortly. And we hope you will find this as a useful tool. And we really and truly look forward to continuing joining efforts with all the partners in the region and beyond to move ahead the implementation of the 2030 agenda in the region. So thank you very much for this important partnership.
Thank you so much, Katia, for your time to be a part of this session and also sharing your reflection. We have very limited time. We need to close very soon because we are given only 1 hour time. So before we close, I'll also request the speakers to also check the chat box. And if it's relevant question to you, then please respond to the participants' question. Yeah, before closing, I'll request Kakai to share what would be the key message from this forum that you want to share to the world.
Yes, Chanda. So this is my key message for today. Indigenous peoples in the Philippines and across Asia are exposed to the spread of the COVID-19 virus in our territories, suffered disproportionately of discrimination, health disparities, abuses due to lockdowns, and continued encroachment of development projects on ancestral lands, massive militarization of IP communities, red tagging and vilification of our community leaders and organizations add more vulnerability of indigenous people, including women, children, and elderly. This generally trampled the collective rights of indigenous peoples and grossly violated our civil and political rights. SDGs disclose ongoing inequalities among indigenous peoples who were further pushed to marginalization due to continuing plunder of forest resources and degradation of biodiversity that further hinder achievement of the SDGs. Amid indigenous women is in the front lines of our struggles and also the drivers in the new normal that must strongly stand to fight and defend our rights as indigenous women, that our voices must be loudly heard from the local, national, and in the global. We have the strong unity and determination to go beyond SDGs framework as we carried along our struggles the genuine freedom and liberty, and we ensure and determine indigenous women and children that no one is left behind. We indigenous women, frontliners, because we are persist as we exist, we must resist.
Thank you, Kakai. That's very powerful. Kamla, it's your time now.
Yeah, thank you, Chanda. I have a very short message. We indigenous women are the knowledge and knowledge holders, not the problem. We have a power to transform to new normal through our knowledge. Stop criminalization of our traditional skills and practices. Recognize our identity and respect self-determination. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kamla. That's short but very powerful again. Yeah, thank you everyone for joining this event. I think it's very clear that this pandemic situation is very challenging to all of us, but at the same time, as indigenous peoples, we have also learned to take this crisis as an opportunity also. So it's also, I think, from the message from our speakers, all three speakers also, I think it's very, very important that all the state and non-state actors and indigenous peoples need stronger collaboration, cooperation to fight against this pandemic and ensuring the partnership with indigenous peoples in good faith through this collaborative partnership to tackle this challenging situation. So yeah, with this, I think I'll have to close this session. Thank you again to all the co-organizers of this event, all the participants who took time to join for an hour. Uh, for the questions related to any of the speakers and to general question to the co-organizers, we'll try to address through the YouTube link that is already shared to you. We'll also try to respond through that. So yes, thank you once again to everyone. Have a good day and good evening to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you to
Thank
all
you.
and good evening.
Thank you. We are still waiting.